Thank you. Yep, you're gonna have to go.
Okay. Nice.
Make sure it's check. Doesn't get floppy while you're talking.
Welcome. You're allowed to talk back. Welcome to Congregational United Church of Christ. My name is Amelia Fulbright, and I am the pastor here. In a few moments, Kathleen Whitmire, who is the chair of our Reproductive Justice Action Team, will give you a better introduction of all our panelists. But I just wanted to take a few moments to thank you for coming here tonight for this conversation. This is brave space that we are holding tonight for a conversation on a topic that is difficult for many people to talk about, that is kind of a lightning rod in our society and a source of a lot of conflict. And it is one of the issues that drove the outcome of our most recent election, and yet we don't talk about it very often in public. And we especially don't talk about it in our congregations very often. So one thing I'd like to lift up before we get started is that in my experience, whenever there is a conversation about the topic of abortion, that even if that's the focus of the conversation, the full range of people's reproductive lives shows up in the room. These are some of the most personal and intimate experiences of our lives. And that's true whether you are a person who has children or a person who doesn't have children. That's true whether you had safe and easy pregnancies, or you've experienced miscarriage or infant loss or infertility. And all of these experiences are tender and emotionally loaded experiences. So I want you to know that as clergy, I think we all hold space for that full range of experiences, even tonight as we talk about some very specific issues that are difficult. We here at Congregational, we believe in holding space for difficult conversations, and we hope that this is just the beginning. So I applaud you for being here. You are the brave ones. And I hope that this is just part one of a series of conversations that we can continue to have together. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Fulbright. I want to join her in welcoming all of you here tonight and thanking you for being here. And I welcome those who are watching us online and those who will be watching our recording later. We all know of the legal and political forces that have limited reproductive rights. These have been driven by conservative, Christian theologies and perspectives that have been the loudest and most privileged voices on this topic. Our goal this evening is to carve out space and time to hear other voices so that we may have a deeper and more informed understanding of personhood, parenthood, and choice. At this time, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and I must say I feel very honored to be moderating this group this evening. By the way, if you saw an earlier version, an earlier flyer, there has been a change in the one panelist. Our first panelist is Rabbi Grace Gleason, the rabbi of Beth David Synagogue here in Greensboro. She has served as a leader in Jewish communities in Chicago, Orlando, New York, and Jerusalem. Originally from a suburb of Chicago, Rabbi Gleason earned a Bachelor of Arts with honors from the University of Chicago and received rabbinic ordination, a Master of Arts, and a certificate in pastoral care and counseling from the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. She is committed to making Jewish tradition acceptable to Jews from all walks of life, especially to women, LGBTQ+ folks, Jews in interfaith relationships, Jews by choice, and others who have been historically excluded from full participation. Our next panelist is the Reverend Michael Usey, lead pastor at College Park, an American Baptist church here in Greensboro, for 31 years. After growing up in San Diego, he was educated at Baylor University, Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and Emory University. He and his wife, Ann, have been married 39 years and have 3 adult children. Reverend Usey has been an escort twice a week at the Women's Choice Clinic of Greensboro for 5.5 years and has been connected with Planned Parenthood since 1985. Next is the Reverend Thelma Flowers, a member here at CUCC. Reverend Flowers received her Master of Divinity from the Iliff School of Theology in Denver and has served as interim clergy for both an Episcopal and a United Methodist Church in New Mexico. She is also a retired mental health clinician of 25 years and more recently a college instructor. She and her beloved life partner of 42 years, Charlotte, relocated to North Carolina from New Mexico in 2018. Reverend Flowers has worn many different hats, often going into situations that others avoid and reaching out to those whom others dismiss. She considers it a blessing, as her mother taught her, to use the gifts, the talents, and the skills that are on loan to her from the Creator for the purpose of assisting in the emotional, the physical, and the spiritual healing of God's beloveds, of every race, every ethnicity, every gender, and every economic status. And our fourth panelist is the Reverend Amelia Fulbright, the lead pastor here at CUCC. She holds a bachelor's degree from Wake Forest University and a Master of Divinity degree from Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. She served several churches in Austin, Texas, before coming to CUCC in December of 2023. Reverend Fulbright has been advocating for reproductive freedom for over a decade, testifying against harmful legislation in Texas and encouraging local congregations to adopt a reproductive justice framework. She believes that Christians in particular have a responsibility to repair the harms done by oppressive anti-choice theologies. Reverend Fulbright's faithfully pro-choice advocacy has been featured by The Cut, the Texas Standard, and Zerlina on Peacock, and she was a founding member of Just Texas, Faith Voices for Reproductive Choice. Panelists, we thank you for being here tonight, and I'm sure that you agree with me, we could not have a finer group of experts to address this. Now, following the presentations by our panelists, we'll have time for them to answer some questions from you. There are index cards at both ends of your pews. You can write your question on a card at any time during the presentation so you don't forget your question, and hold it up so an usher can come and get it from you. Our panelists will answer as many questions as they can in the time we have left. So let us begin. We'll all share this one. Thank you. All right, our first question. As it relates to reproductive rights, give a brief overview of your denomination's theological or spiritually held ideology. Specifically, what is your faith's belief about the beginning of life, contraception, IVF, and abortion? Is there a range of beliefs within your faith regarding these issues, and have these beliefs changed over time? Rabbi Gleason, we'll begin with you.
Thank you. So I want to begin by quoting one of my teachers, Rabbi Aviva Richman, who taught in an introduction to the topic of reproductive rights in Judaism that in our tradition there is no law without story. And I was just thinking during Reverend Fulbright's introduction and in your listing of all of our different theological degrees that part of what I think gives this group of people authority to speak on this topic is not necessarily our theological education, but the fact that we have been in the room with people who are making incredibly difficult decisions, and we've heard their stories. And we've been in the room with people who are going through pregnancy loss, infertility, and any number of issues that touch on this topic. And we've heard and collected those stories. And there is no law in Jewish tradition without story. And I think that what Rabbi Richmond meant in talking about that was that in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, we don't start with a list of laws, but we start with a story of the creation of the universe, and stories are interspersed throughout with law. When we get to the oral law in the Talmud, it's an anthology that goes back and forth between stories about people and laws. And the wisdom that I take with this as sort of a framework of how I think about this topic is that everything that we're talking about is not a theological abstraction, but is grounded in the real stories of real people. And I also want to frame each of these topics that you listed with a verse from Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19, which says, I'll read in Hebrew and then translate it, Uvacharta b'chaim laman tichya ata v'zarecha. Choose life so that you and your children may live. And this is a verse that has often been cited for anti-choice purposes to say, choose life. But in reading this verse more recently, what struck me as incredibly powerful about it is that choice and life go together. Uvacharta b'chaim, choose life, and what is foregrounded is choice. And I want to bring a set of questions from another teacher, Rabbi Leah Rachel Berkowitz, who talks about how in these conversations, such as the one we're about to have, the question that is often asked is, when does life begin? And whose life is prioritized in making medical decisions? And she asserted that the questions that we should really be asking is not when does life begin and whose life matters most, but the question in a tradition that tells us choose life is, what is the most life-affirming decision we can make in this moment, and who gets to make that decision? And that is the overall set of questions that I'm guided by in thinking about this topic. So I wanted to say that first. What is the most life-affirming decision that we can make in this moment, and who gets to make that decision? That is the set of questions that I'm oriented to. And that being said, I also want to fairly represent some of the traditional Jewish views on each of these topics that you listed that I'll just share very quickly, understanding that there's a huge range of interpretation across Judaism and variation within these topics. The beginning of life question is complex. One answer that's reflected in our text is when the baby is halfway out into the world and takes its first breath. That is reflected in some of our texts. The question of contraception, there is a prohibition of the spilling of seed, and for that reason in Orthodox Jewish law, barrier contraception such as condoms are prohibited, and other forms of contraception such as birth control pills or IUDs are permitted. IVF is fully permitted, and there are special ways that you might have to do it because of the spilling of seed prohibition. Generally, abortion is not only permitted but required in all branches of Judaism in the situation when the person who is giving birth, their life is in danger. If the pregnancy poses a threat to the physical or the mental health of the mother, almost all Jewish sources would say that abortion is permitted in those cases, balanced with the value of potential life. So that's a very broad strokes answer to each of those topics.
I'm an American Baptist, and so in Baptist tradition, no Baptist speaks for any other Baptist. So what I say is my own ideas. There's no American Baptist position on when personhood begins, on conception or IVF or abortion. Those are left up to the individual churches and congregations to make stands on those and work on those. There's no theology that's inculcated in American Baptist churches about when ensoulment begins. There is this strong idea about religious liberty, that no church or no government should tell other people about how to make these incredibly crucial decisions, that this should be a definitive separation between church and state, but it also should be between the woman and her God. And so that notion of religious liberty, of trusting and respecting women's decisions is very important. In the 60s and the 70s, American Baptist churches came out in support of legalized abortion. And of course, that changed in the late 70s as that was picked up by conservative political ideology as something to, because they couldn't win on civil rights, this would be a way to get whoever they wanted elected. So American Baptist churches don't really, as a group, don't take a stand on that.
I'm representing the womanist theology aspect of reproductive justice. Now, womanists can be from any denomination if they choose. The choice is very, very important. Now, womanist theology comes as a result of the history of of black women, slave women, during the slaveocracy of this country. So womanist theology is, there's some feminist, black feminist aspects in it. There are some liberationist aspects in it. However, liberationists, for the most part, got started with males, so there are some discrepancies there. So there's a little bit of that in there as well. I was part of the feminist movement early on. I was part of whenever it started breaking up. And it was breaking up because of the fact that the opinions and the needs of African American women and brown women were not being totally viewed. So in womanist theology, there is no clear definition as to when life begins. However, there are three rights in the theology that says that, one, individuals have a right to have children, individuals have a right not to have children, and when they do have children, they want to be able to have children grow up in an environment that is healthy, not just physically healthy, but in the environment of a society that is healthy. So those are all about choice. Okay, so now with in vitro, again, as long as the individual, woman, trans male, or non-binary person decides to have that procedure, it's considered okay. When it comes to contraception, of course, that's considered, if the person chooses, also okay, because it has to do with the fact that it's a choice that the person is making. It's not a choice that's being made for them. And that comes out of the history of slaveocracy, where so many women were forced to have children that they did not want to have. They were having their master's children. And there are feminist theology, womanist theology says above all, it has to be the choice of the woman, or the individual. So if they choose to have contraceptions in order to improve the quality of their life, because forcing women to have children when they're not ready, when they're not economically feasible, when it's not economically feasible, those are hardships. And we're saying we don't want hardships placed upon women. Again, when it comes to abortion, like Reverend Fulbright said, these are not easy situations, that choices that women make or individuals make. However, again, it's the quality of life. If you're a woman and you have 3 or 4 children and you decide you do not want to have another child, then you have the right. Whatever you need to do for your quality of life is acceptable.
So I'm going to speak to the United Church of Christ as a denomination. I've only been UCC for 5-ish years officially, I guess. I grew up Southern Baptist, so that I might talk about that a little bit later. But interestingly enough, the United Church of Christ has actually said quite a bit about this topic. For those who aren't familiar, the United Church of Christ is a relatively young denomination that formed in the 1950s when and it could be argued 5, that's right, 5 if you include the African American Christian tradition, which unsurprisingly the white folks forgot about for about 75 years, and we're trying to rectify that. So 5 other smaller denominational streams came together to form the UCC, and at our regular national meetings called General Synods, at every gathering, the denomination passes resolutions about various topics. Structurally, the UCC is kind of like Baptist in the sense that every congregation has a lot of autonomy. So these resolutions are not binding in the sense that all UCCers have to abide by these decisions, but they are reflective of the general consensus of the body at that moment in time. And so I'm just gonna quote you some things from a few of the synods, and then I'll offer some more particular comments. In the early 70s, so post the Roe versus Wade decision, the 8th General Synod issued a resolution in which it says, "Thus we affirm the freedom with which God endowed men and women, but we affirm and receive this as freedom bound to responsibility." So nothing specific about abortion in there, but it gets increasingly specific, as you'll see as we move into the late 80s. In 1981, the 13th General Synod said that their consensus was that the question of when life begins is primarily a theological question on which denominations or religious groups must be permitted to establish and follow their own teachings. Then in 1987, the 16th General Synod came out with a resolution that held 3 basic principles. One, it said that the 16th General Synod affirms the sacredness of all life and the need to protect and defend human life in particular. It says in number 2 that it does encourage persons facing unplanned pregnancies to consider giving birth and parenting the child or releasing the child for adoption before considering abortion. But then it goes on to say in point 3 that it upholds the right of men and women to have access to adequately funded family planning service and to safe legal abortions as one option among others. And then in 1989, it's the 17th General Synod said this, which I think really reflects the current general consensus of our denomination, although it should be said that with any issue in the UCC, there may be congregations that this perspective does not represent. But this is what the 17th General Synod said. The 17th General Synod of the United Church of Christ reaffirms its historic and courageous leadership in support of freedom of choice as legally supported by Roe v. Wade, and urges all parts of the church to work toward a society where a full range of reproductive options are available to all women regardless of economic circumstances, and to address the root cause that leads to unplanned pregnancies, ignorance, and the lack of life options. So you can kind of see that as the culture began to change and push back against the right to safe and legal abortion, the denomination has become increasingly willing to stake out a position in that conversation. I would say that there's no real consensus on exactly when life begins. And I think one of the things that has caught progressive Christians in general off guard is that typically the way we thought about these things historically was not to try to pinpoint a moment when life begins. I mean, it's similar to what I think Rabbi Grace was saying, in that the question would be, what is the most life-affirming decision in this moment, and who gets to make that decision? So I think it would vary. Even in my own congregation, the answer to that question would vary from person to person. And there is no consensus in the Christian theological history about that question, which I think is a really important point because of the way it gets talked about in the culture, as if personhood begins at fertilization is somehow self-evident from studying Christian teaching. And so I think in general, if you looked at the UCC in recent years, you would see a pretty bold network of advocacy around trying to restore reproductive rights and even expand. But the other thing that I think kind of stands out within the UCC is the commitment to comprehensive sexuality education. The UCC partnered with the Unitarian Universalists in creating a curriculum called Our Whole Lives, and it provides age-appropriate comprehensive sexuality education for children, who are just starting to learn the names of their body parts, all the way up through seniors. And it emphasizes all the, accurate health information, but it also has a social, emotional component that helps young people think about decisions, about when to become sexually active and how to make those decisions and how to access contraception. And so that's an aspect of our denomination that I'm really proud of, and so I try to lift it up whenever I can.
Thank you. Now, reminder, if you had any questions during that, feel free to pick up that index card, jot down the question, and wave it in the air. And one of our ushers will come and get that, and we can address it at the end. You can hold that up at any point. All right, our next question. What are the specific scriptures, texts, or writings that have been traditionally used to regulate and or to suppress the reproductive rights of individuals? And what scriptures, texts, or writings do you use to counter these traditionally held ideologies? And Reverend Flowers, we'll start with you on this one, please.
So, womanist theology is offered as a corrective to the exclusion of women from Africa, women of African descent, brown women, and other marginalized persons in the canon of the scriptures, from the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And throughout the text, what you find is that women are invisible, omitted, marginalized, or villainized, according to the needs and the writings of the interpreters. So how many of you remember being in church when somebody was saying the names of, when the minister was not saying but spitting out the names of Bathsheba, Jezebel, Delilah? Okay, so what feminists are saying, what womanists are saying is that, okay, you can villainize us, but you don't know our whole story. And so they're saying, okay, we need to tell the story. You need to know the factors about it. You just can't label a person. And so what the method that womanist theologians use is called rereading. You're asked to reread. So you look at the scripture, the text. You don't try to, rewrite it or put people in there that don't belong there. But what you do is that you go outside of the biblical canon and you look for other sources that will allow you to get a more inclusive idea of who the woman is. Okay. So rereading can mean bringing in more than non-traditional sources. One of the stories that's used, and one of the texts, is the situation between Hagar and Sarah. It has all of the components of abuse, because we know what happened, that Sarah gave her slave over to her husband, and then she got really upset about it because she thought that Hagar was making fun of her because she couldn't have a child. And so then Hagar runs away, meets an angel, has an encounter with an angel. Angel says to go back. She goes back. She's treated very, very badly. Sarah decides that she has to go again, so she leaves again. And she spends time in the wilderness. And so it's like every situation, and that's where she has an encounter with God. So when in womanist theology, it's okay, you cannot know a person's life unless you know their pain. And you cannot give a full representation of a woman in the text unless you truly know her story. And what do I use when I'm telling these to counter situations? I have a bunch of things. Eco-womanism was written by Melanie Harris, who was we were in school together at the school, Ida School of Theology. So I recommend this book very highly. Where it all began, where the definition of womanism came from Alice Walker when she, in her book, In Search of My Mother's Garden. And it came from the idea that, you know, when you're growing up in a traditionally African or African American family, and you're, you know, some people say you're smelling yourself, you know, some of us have heard that, or it's that we're being womanish. We're acting as if beyond our age, and we're trying to act like a woman when we're not truly women. But the reality is that that's a good thing. You know, Alice Walker says that's a good thing. And that to be a womanist is to be somebody who's not just concerned about herself, but she's concerned about her family, her community, the world at large. She's very, very inclusive, is the whole concept. And that a womanist is a very spiritual person as well. And then finally, this book just came out. It came out in 2016, and I was introduced to it. It's called Womanist Interpretations of the Bible. I encourage everybody to get a copy, especially clergy. That it would be very important in terms of interpreting the lives of women in the canon. Okay, it's called Womanist Interpretation of the Bible, Expanding the Discourse. It's edited by J.L. Bryan and Vanessa Lovelace. And so when you hear womanist theology, names that come up are Catherine Cannon, Dolores Williams, and Vanessa Reams. Those are very wonderful names, women who were the pioneers of the womanist movement. And also there are secular writings, Alice Walker, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Maya Angelou, any writing that helps to tell a full story about a woman's lived experiences.
So the first question is about what texts and traditions, right? Well, one from it's from the Hebrew Bible, but so I'll be interested to see if Rabbi Grace has any thoughts about this. But it is often used in anti-choice arguments. It's Psalm 139, and in my translation, I'll just read a few verses. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. So this is often held up as a justification for not only laws against abortion, but the new personhood laws that are establishing that life begins at fertilization. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit about biology here, because one of the things that I've learned in doing reproductive justice work is a lot of people don't understand basic reproductive biology. So the anti-abortion movement has the goalposts keep moving. So there used to be heartbeat laws that establish personhood when a heartbeat can be detected in a fetus. And Then the language changed to personhood begins at conception. But conception, if you've ever been pregnant, you know, is not the same as fertilization, because an egg must be fertilized and implanted in the uterus for an actual pregnancy to take root. This is why your gynecologist often won't even see you until you're 8 weeks along and it's clear that an embryo has implanted in the uterus. But the new standard is fertilization, which means simply a fertilized egg, which is why personhood laws threaten the practice of IVF, because embryos in a petri dish technically meet the standard of personhood. And this scripture is often used to support that viewpoint. And it offends my sensibilities as a clergy person because it breaks one of the basic rules of biblical interpretation, which in my humble summary is something like, don't use poetry as medical science. This image of knitting is a beautiful image of the immanence of God, the presence of God with us from the very beginnings of our lives, as far back, even before we were conceived, that the divine has somehow been at work in who we are. And I love this passage. This passage was my mother's favorite scripture growing up, so I heard it a lot. But I don't think anyone literally envisions God knitting babies together in a womb. And so I think it's a really oppressive and irresponsible use of sacred scripture. When it comes to the question about what writings or scriptures or traditions that I've really claimed to counter that type of interpretation, I have to tell a little bit of a story. So I grew up Southern Baptist, I mentioned that, and I remember in the mid to late 80s when my church in rural western North Carolina started having Sanctity of Life Sundays. And I did not realize what they were about at the time because we didn't say the word abortion in church. But there was a picture of an unborn child, a fetus, in the bulletin. And so it was clear what the service was about, even though it was not explicitly said. And I remember having conversations with my mother about girls in the community that had, quote, made a mistake. And they only made it one time, sort of speaking about unplanned pregnancies, teenage pregnancies in these kind of hushed tones. And then the implication of these Sundays being that abortion would not be a faithful choice, really, in any situation. And then I went to seminary, and I took an ethics course. And in a book about stem cell research, it talked about rabbinic teachings about personhood and how generally within the Jewish tradition, life begins at first breath. And it dawned on me that if you were going to ask, what would Jesus think about abortion? It would probably look a lot more like what the rabbis taught than what my Southern Baptist teachers taught. Jesus doesn't say anything about abortion in our scriptures. So that was a major turning point for me. But I think if you look in the New Testament at how Jesus treats women, particularly women who have made choices or have expressed their sexuality in ways that are deemed inappropriate by the society, he always meets them with compassion and respect, and he does not seem concerned with their choices. He seems concerned with their belonging and their embrace back into the community. That's what his concern seems to be about. So I personally, that's where I land. Yeah.
So the text that first comes to mind as just a framework in general is when Rabbi Hillel, about 2,000 years ago, was asked to summarize the Torah while standing on one foot, meaning do it really quickly. The summary was, that which is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor, which is sort of the inverse of ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, with a very important, I think, slightly different meaning, because we can't always know what our neighbor, how they want to be loved, or what is best for them, but it's pretty easy to understand what is hateful to someone and what is not good for them. And that guides me with just an intuitive moral sense of, we understand how horrible it must be to be forced to be pregnant, be forced to give birth, etc. And here I also think of a story which is recent and emotional for me to think about, a story of one of my dear friends who I will leave anonymous and hope that I have her permission to share for the purpose of increasing freedom and dignity in life. That I have a friend who recently, as I went to go visit her in another state, was about to tell us that she was pregnant, but unfortunately found out at her appointment that the pregnancy wasn't viable, and if she carried this pregnancy to term and gave birth, the child would not live for more than a few minutes. And I was with her in the time before she had a medical abortion, and in those days when she was still carrying the pregnancy, knowing that she would not actually deliver a healthy child. And I just spoke to her about what this experience was like, and she said, I cannot imagine being in this agony of still being pregnant, knowing that I won't have a child for 6 more months, and then going through the pain of labor. And that exact situation is what some of the proposed laws and changes and abortion bans that are currently up for debate in our country would mandate, that people would be in her exact situation and would need to go through the entire pregnancy and give birth knowing that the child would die. And to me, understanding at a basic level that which is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor, that is a situation that would be hateful, that would be horrible to pretty much every person. I won't make a 100% generalization, but you can understand why that is hateful. And so that is a guiding principle, sort of separate from the Jewish legal history of how do we think about this topic, which I will also share. In our tradition, recently, there is a Torah portion of Mishpatim in which the verse where our thinking about how to determine the status of a fetus, of a life, of the mother's life, comes into play in a sort of troubling text from the book of Exodus, chapter 21, verse 22, that this is sort of the source text in Jewish legal tradition for how do we understand abortion later, which says, when men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a pregnancy loss results, but no other damage to her occurs, the one responsible will be fined, as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life. So there's a lot to unpack here that's all sorts of other problematic things, but honing in on the learning that we get from this verse about choice and reproduction, that we understand when a life is taken away, the punishment is much more severe, and when damage to property occurs in this ancient law, the punishment is monetary. You have to pay a fine. And so what is understood from this verse that sort of a lot of other legal tradition flows from is that the pregnancy loss is a monetary fine. It's not a death penalty situation. Putting aside a whole bunch of other issues with just everything about that, what we can glean from it with respect to reproductive rights is that the fetus is not considered a life in the same way that the mother's life is considered a life, and a lot flows from that conclusion from this verse. In the Mishnah, which is about a 2,000-year-old text, and as Reverend Fulbright was saying, and I saw that there's a question about how would the first century rabbis have thought about these topics of contraception and abortion, and one other thing. This is an example of the writings and teachings of that time, of how were the first century rabbis thinking about this. That we have the teaching from that time, again, difficult material, from the Talmud, quoting from an earlier text. A minor, lest she become pregnant and die from this pregnancy, a pregnant woman, lest her older fetus become deformed, as was their scientific understanding at the time, or a nursing woman, lest she has to wean her child too early, are able to use contraception. So even though there was sort of a general sense that people shouldn't be using contraception among these first century rabbis, there are these exceptions made for situations that cause difficulty or trouble for the mother. So that's one example sort of addressing that question. And I wanted to share one more text that's the basis of a lot of Jewish law surrounding abortion, that is from Maimonides, a 12th century rabbi who quotes from earlier texts and rules that when someone is having difficulty giving birth, this is difficult, one may cut up the child within her womb either by drugs or by surgery, because the fetus is regarded like a pursuer that is seeking to kill her. Once the head has emerged, the fetus may not be touched, for we do not set aside one life for another. So that is another foundational, traditional Jewish understanding of how we understand when life begins and when abortion is not only permitted but is actually required in order to save the life of the person giving birth.
Thank you. I don't think it's possible to deal with with conservative, anti-choice, anti-abortion folks on the issue of sacred texts, because they don't view sacred texts in the same way that we do. So it's very hard to have a dialogue about that. If you've if you've listened to them, you know that they cite Psalm 22:10, "You have been my God from my mother's womb," and Jeremiah 1:5, "Before I was formed in the womb." And from the New Testament, they're big on Luke 1, that the child will be conceived in his mother, be filled with the Spirit in his mother's womb. And so we know from linguistic theory, right, that all reading is misreading. And so it's very difficult to have a dialogue with them about that aspect, about the way they use sacred text is not the way that a majority of progressive Christians and Jews would come at sacred text. They do take, I know that conservative scholars like John Piper take real issue with the reading of Exodus 21, and they contend that yasa doesn't mean miscarriage, and they parse that kind of to no end. Conservative scholar Richard Hayes, who just passed away recently, when he was writing in the late 80s and 90s, said there are no texts in the Bible that supports banning abortion. And so he looked at Christian tradition to kind of go on from that. So he didn't find that there was any guidance at all in that, and that was from a conservative scholar. Lastly, I just want to amplify something that Reverend Flowers said about we're using this term reproductive justice. That was coined in 1994 by a group of 12 black women who met after a Clinton health conference, and it really is comprised of four things: the right not to have a child, the right to have a child, the right to parent in a healthy environment, and the right to sexual pleasure. And so I think kind of the root of that, the moral norm of that, is that we should trust women, and that's not a radical norm at all. It only feels radical in a world where we don't trust or respect the decisions that women make about having or not having children. By women, I mean people who get pregnant persons.
Thank you. And our third question. And I'm going to throw a little curve to you, but it's a minor one. They knew the questions, and so now I'm going to tweak it. Not very fair, but a little bit. Because someone submitted a question I think I can fold into this. So the third question is, in your view, what role can and should faith communities play in advocating for reproductive rights and justice? And this person asked, and how can progressive faith leaders unite to stand up on the assault on reproductive freedom, and what obstacles are currently in the way? So I think we can fold this in. If not, just do number 3, and we'll handle that later. All right, let's see. I think we are starting with you.
Right. So clergy are famous for telling you things that you already know. So here goes. Let me give you 9 quick suggestions about things that we can do as persons of faith. First of all, to listen to people who can get pregnant, to people that have experiences. It's so crucial. We don't do anything else. We should listen. I know that the Catholic diocese in Chicago in the late 80s said that they were going to spend a whole year of not saying anything but just inviting women to come speak about their experience, because women's people who can get pregnant, their reproductive histories are sacred. Secondly, to read everything that we can. We've probably bought 100 copies of Ejaculate Responsibly, which is always a fun thing to say from the pulpit, right? A whole new way to think about abortion. This is a great book to give to even conservative people. It's by a Mormon mom, and talks about how we have really neglected the role of men in creating unwanted pregnancies. super book. I know many of you have already read Trust Women by Toddy Peters, the Elon Scholar. If you haven't, this is an amazing book. There's also a good Substack called Abortion Every Day that has just amazing things to say and is well written. Thirdly, we can certainly, and as one of you already mentioned, advocate for complete sex ed in our churches. When I first started serving a church after seminary, it was in Waco, Texas in 1984, and of course there was no sex ed being done. It was just Nancy, Reagan saying, just say no. So, because we were responsible for youth in college, we quickly contacted Planned Parenthood, and they had excellent people to come out and talk about that. That needs to be something that comes from the congregation as well, and not just clergy. Fourthly, say the word abortion. We should be saying that all the time, and that we should normalize that. Fifthly, there is an app that's on your phone, probably many of you already use, called 5 Calls, and it lists yeah, okay, so all of you are nodding, but it's an app that tells you who you should call and about different kinds of issues. About every other week, there's issues that we can be contacting our senators and representatives about health care and reproductive justice. You can certainly give. There's North Carolina Abortion Fund. You can drive as an escort. It's really important that we get people to the actual clinic here in Greensboro. And in order to do that, they have to drive past, a whole parade of protesters. So you can drive. Every week we have people who are volunteering to drive to bring people to the clinic. And you can escort. We always need escorts. I escort 2 mornings a week from 8 to 10 o'clock. Just, we're glorified parking attendants. That's really all we are. We're just trying to get women past the protesters so that they can have an appointment with healthcare providers. And then lastly, speak about these things. Recently, I encouraged my congregation to speak about abortion in terms of parenthood being sacred, that abortions can be a moral choice, and that our church, and like this church, values and respects and trusts women. And those are things that need to be said out loud in many, many spaces. Who's next?
So I believe, first and foremost, in education. The members of the faith community should be educated about the issues related to reproductive justice and the impact that it, or the lack of it, has in the lived experiences of individuals, to have and allow for courageous, honest, and inclusive dialogue concerning reproductive justice. To encourage members of the faith community to contact your local, state, and federal lawmakers, sign petitions, even if you get to the, sign the petition, even if they say, and now donate, sign it anyway. And when possible, to show up, show out in the name of and in the pursuit of reproductive justice, and to remember that reproductive justice means that women have the right to control our sexuality, our gender, our work, our reproduction, and that right can only be achieved when all women, all girls, have the complete economic, social, political power and resources to make healthy decisions about our bodies, our families, and our communities in all areas of our lives.
Well, gosh, Michael, you were so comprehensive. You really were. Yeah. I think I'll just take a couple of your points and just highlight and add to a little bit. In Christian communities, I think one thing that we can do is embrace the incarnation. It's the central doctrine of our faith that this body, this flesh, is divine. It's not just a spirit that's housed in a body that, like some of the Greeks taught, that is evil or inconsequential, that actually our bodies are important and sacred and revelatory about God. Unfortunately, I think for a lot of Christians, we have not fully embraced that as a doctrine, and it shows up, well, and part of that is because for millennia, it was only men writing theology. And so they certainly weren't writing about, except to make laws sometimes, religious law, the experience of menstruating or labor or nursing as sacred, holy experiences. And even at points we're teaching that the female body was in itself somehow evil, a source of temptation, and inferior to the male body in some way. And I really think all of those threads of thought are still showing up in our conversations around abortion and reproductive justice. So I think as Christians, we have a duty to increase our comfort level talking about bodies and sexuality in general, and that can be a springboard for talking then about abortion and reproductive health decisions. I agree with Michael that we need to practice saying the word abortion in church. And I think we need to practice not always talking about it as a bad thing. It is sometimes a tragic thing. I don't know any person with a uterus that when they're a kid says, boy, I'm going to grow up and have an abortion. But it's not always a bad thing. It's another point where we need to listen to the stories of women. For some women, it's the thing that saves their life. For some women, it feels like a relief. For some women, it means not having to carry the child of their abuser. And what I have found as a pastor is that even in some of the most progressive churches in the country, women who've had abortions feel that they cannot share that experience in church. And it's really heartbreaking. So the more we talk about it, the more we can be freed from our own shame and stigma, and then we can be healing space for women who have been shamed because of their reproductive health choices. And thankfully, there are now more organizations, both state organizations and national organizations, that are working on helping congregations have these conversations. The Sacred Alliance for Reproductive Dignity has a beautiful curriculum that teaches about the origins of the reproductive justice framework and helps congregations become more comfortable having these conversations. So I always try to do a little commercial because it's a really good curriculum. I feel like I was going to say one other thing, but I think that's it.
So just to bring it full circle and to reflect a little bit what I've heard and shared, a theme that I hear that is recurring throughout what all of us have shared is stories, individuals, listening, and that is really the basis. And when I think about what we can do together, I feel incredibly grateful just to be with my colleagues and Reverend Flowers, Reverend Fulbright, Reverend UC, that we can be so powerful together. And I feel a strong sense of urgency around this issue right now, that this is not something to just wait and see what happens, but this is going to affect many, many people's real lives, including possibly our own. And we need to take action. And I think that what has been modeled and what we've been talking about is something that we need to continue to do powerfully, which is claiming religious authority on this conversation that has been so co-opted, as you shared in your introduction, Kathleen, that we have authority to speak on this issue from a religious perspective, and we need to continue to claim that authority in the form of speaking about it publicly, in the form of lobbying our elected officials, as you shared. And I was heartened a few years ago, and I think there have been several cases of this, but I'm thinking a few years ago when I was in Florida and was heartened that some rabbis sued the state on the grounds of religious freedom over an abortion ban because it violates our religious freedom as Jews to not be able to have access to abortion. And this is a legal pathway that is available to us that I think we should take advantage of, that perhaps it violates your religious freedom as Christians, as womanists, to not be able to access an abortion. This is what we need to gain momentum around and use to our advantage legally and electorally and in our congregations. And we need to claim our religious authority.
Do we have any more questions? Anyone else there have a question? Okay, we had one that we do have another one? Okay, you're writing it? Thank you. And we kind of sort of skirted this one. What I'm going to do is ask to circle very quickly because there was a little more depth to the question here. Thank you, John. How can progressive faith leaders unite? How can we unite, and what obstacle is preventing that? Can we do a very quick pass, like one idea of how we can unite and one obstacle and move around? I'll give you a minute to, whoever has come up with something, reach for the mic. Thank you.
I hope that folks here who I know, some people are from Beth David and there's people from CUCC, that I hope that folks here talk to each other. I think that something we can do to unite is just get to know each other across denominations and faith traditions. I think an obstacle that's in our way right now is that there is so much going on that we are distracted by every new outrageous thing that happens, and we need to have a decision and a focused effort to focus on one thing at a time, or we'll always be focusing on more than one thing at a time. But we have the obstacle in front of us of the temptation to be scattered and constantly outraged, and we have our faith traditions to ground us and to not let that happen.
Okay. Melanie Harris, in the book that I just showed you, Eco-Womenism, offers a term that's called life streams to introduce as a means of expressing a womanist sense of agency and choice and self-naming and embracing religious identity or spirituality. Harris offers the adoption of this term to facilitate interfaith and interreligious dialogues concerning the lived experiences of women around the world. So to understand that this is not just an issue here in our country, it's all over the world, that our sisters and our trans males and our non-binary people are suffering. And so it's important for us to look at it with I agree, a sense of urgency. You know, if we truly believe that we're all members of the same Creator, all beloved children of the same Creator, then we have a responsibility to our brothers, our sisters, our individuals of different genders, to say enough is enough, and we need to do what we can do.
I think one obstacle that keeps churches from taking on this topic is clergy who don't want to take on this topic. On the list of social justice issues that clergy can take on, ironically, this is like one of the least sexy to most clergy. They don't want to touch it. And there's good, I understand the reasons for that. But you may or may not know that before Roe versus Wade, there was a something called the Clergy Consultation Network that was basically a kind of secret network of clergy that helped women get to states where they could access abortion. Yeah. And actually, we have a person in the room that was part of that Clergy Consultation Network, Reverend John Porter, sitting in the back. And so there is a history in the Christian tradition of clergy being really brave about this. And I think we need to recover that courage. To quote my predecessor, the great Julie Peoples, we don't need any more scared clergy.
Do we have another question coming up? Indivisible Guilford County, Greensboro Reproductive Freedom Rally. Join us as we rally on the 3rd anniversary of the fall of Roe v. Wade. This is wonderful. This is Tuesday, June 24th, 5:30, 301 West Market Street. Could you send this to me, forward it? And then I'm going to forward it, we'll put it in our newsletter. We have set up a little corner that we call our opportunities for activism, and we'll put it in there. Thank you. And I would encourage you to put it in yours. So, but thank you. Let's get the word out on that. It's excellent. We had one more question, if anyone would like or could address this. Is there a support group for women who have had an abortion? This would be a safe space for women to share their pain having been through this. Mental, social, medical, and other services could be provided. Does anybody know of anything that has happened like that?
I would just say I know that they exist. I'm not familiar with one in Guilford County, but I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't. I'm just not aware of it.
I am also not aware of one that already exists, but just wanted to say in response to that, I think that a faith community is a place where that would be an amazing thing for us to start. And also just, I don't want to speak for everybody, but just that clergy might not be thought of as the first people that you would go to talk about that, but I can say for myself, and I think for everybody, that we are available and want to provide support in that situation in a non-coercive, non-judgmental way, in a fully supportive way. And this isn't specifically related to abortion, though it could include that, but a organization that I've become aware of that's been very helpful to a lot of people that I know is called I Was Supposed to Have a Baby. And if you just search that, you will find many online support groups and some in-person support groups, though I don't know about in Greensboro, for people who have experienced pregnancy loss, including people who have medically terminated pregnancies. That is an incredible resource that I would refer people to.
Thank you. Just briefly, any last thought or comment? As you've listened to one another, I don't know if anything spurred an additional comment. There's much to take in. Any other questions? All right, I'm going to stand up because it's hard to twist to see you. So if you'll allow me to do that. So it's time to wrap up. Although I'd like to go for hours, but there is so much to digest on what these wonderful people have shared with us so graciously tonight. So I want to express sincere appreciation to these incredible panelists for their generosity of time and expertise. I know we have all found this incredibly enlightening, and I would hope helpful in forming our own views so we can openly engage in discussions and debates on reproductive rights. I'd also like to thank our Reproductive Justice Action team here at CUCC for planning this event. It's Reverend Fulbright, Herb Baum, Linda Fields, Ann Barton, Lynn Wright Kernodle, Carol Neufeld, John Neufeld, and Reverend Flowers. Thanks for additional support this evening from a group we call our supporters: Lynn Smith, Brenda James, who are members here at CUCC, and Keisha Frederick, who is a member of Mount Zion Baptist Church. Thanks are also due to CUCC staff, who helped with promotional materials, AV and setup: Judy Page, Emily Hoover, Chris Shields, and Jimmy Buchanan. Now we'd like to invite you to continue this work. First, you're welcome to join our Reproductive Justice Action team. And you don't have to be a member of CUCC to do that. We would welcome any of you who are not a member here and would like to join us. And you don't need to be a Christian to join our team. We would welcome you, just as we have welcomed Herb. Or if for some reason you can't commit to monthly meetings, we meet once a month, you can be a supporter and you can receive occasional email updates and advocacy alerts. And if you're interested in being either a team member or supporter, please write your name and email address on one of the index cards at the end of the pew, and you can leave it in the baskets that are next to the door back there or hand them to me. We would welcome your involvement. We are also asking you, those of you who are not from CUCC, take this back to your own congregations. This event was recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel and our Facebook page. Encourage your members to watch this. You can also share the handout we gave you when you arrived. If you already have a social justice committee or a reproductive issues committee, we would welcome collaborating with you on activities. We can do the work if we do it together. So thank you again for being here this evening. Blessings to you all. Good night.